Hi everyone, Claire here and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I'm excited to share how I drew this cute little bird scene, a gorgeous Siskin chilling among some pine and berries, all drawn with coloured pencil. I'll also sprinkle in some tips and tricks along the way, so you can give it a go for yourself if you wish. And as always, the full class along with all the extras is over on my Patreon channel. I think this is class number 78 or 79 or so. So it's turning into quite the collection of goodies over there. Anyway, I won't ramble on too much. Let's jump straight into it, shall we? For this piece, I decided to use a surface I've come to really love recently, and that is drafting film. I absolutely adore how smooth this surface is. The colours lay down like butter, and I adore how wonderfully it erases as well. And when I say erases, I'm not just talking about fixing mistakes, although it's great for that too. I mean erasing pigment intentionally to create certain effects and highlights, which you'll see exactly what I mean in just a little bit. Now for pencils, I stuck with my usual favourites, Faber-Castell Polychromos and Caran d'Ache Luminance. I started by blocking in the Siskin's eye with a super sharp black pencil. Drafting film is pretty forgiving, but when it comes to sharp pencils, they're an absolute must if you want to nail those crisp little details. See what I mean here as I work on that super defined ring around the eye? It's really satisfying. Anyway, I got the eyeball in place and then I eased up on the pressure and started lightly sketching in the shadows and the shapes around the eye, still sticking to the black areas for now. This step is all about getting those key shapes down to build a solid foundation for the rest of the bird's head. So next up was the beak, and this little guy's beak was surprisingly quite colourful for such a tiny bird. I layered a mix of yellows, browns and even a pinch of cinnamon just to get that right look. To make the reflections pop, I added a little bit of cream and the tiniest touch of blue. I guess these birds' beaks are quite reflective, so they were picking up quite a few colours from its surroundings. But honestly, blending on this drafting film was just a dream. It really is one of the reasons I keep coming back to this surface. So here is where one of my quirky processes comes into play. I sometimes, not always, but sometimes like to apply details first and then add colour and tone afterwards. And as you can see here, I'm mapping out the feather direction on the Siskin's head with details. I made sure to follow the bird's feather direction using slightly curved lines instead of straight ones, and this just helps to capture that rounded shape and contour of the head, and it just makes everything look a little bit more natural. And now for my favourite part, adding the yellow. I don't know about you, but there's something so satisfying about adding a cheerful pop of brightness, especially when we've been working on dull colours so far. So using a bit of firm pressure, I went over the areas I had just drawn to really saturate the yellow and get a good coverage. I then started to work on the shadows, and for the base of the neck I brought in my favourite complementary colour for yellow, which is olive green yellowish. That's the Polychromos pencil. Honestly, I think this is probably one of my favourite pencils of all time, and it really does work great with yellow as well, and it just gives everything a little bit of a nice earthy tone. So to warm things up even more, I added a few touches of brown, and that really gave the shadows a richer, more natural feel. Now onto what is probably the second most satisfying part of this drawing, and that is using a craft knife to pull out the highlights and those lighter strands of feather details. I used a slice ceramic knife tool. I'll pop the link in the description if you're interested. But honestly, the way that a craft knife and drafting film work together is just a dream. It really is a very forgiving surface when applying a craft knife for highlights. As I mentioned earlier, the knife is essentially erasing some of the pigment to reveal the highlights. So what is happening here is that I'm removing the pigment to expose the white of the paper underneath. But here's the thing, I don't actually want white highlights. I want really soft, light yellow highlights, just like we see on the Siskin's details itself. I want light yellow where the light is hitting. So this is where the magic happens. I flipped the paper upside down. Yep, flipped it. So because drafting film is translucent, you can actually add colour to the back of your drawing and it'll show through on the front. So I quickly shaded, quite roughly actually. It really doesn't matter how neat it is as long as we've got a smooth layer of pigment. So I shaded a layer of yellow on the reverse side, and when you flip it back over, those highlights now have that soft yellow glow that I wanted. and it was just incredibly satisfying. So from there, it's just a matter of refining, adding more details and all the usual tweaking. So from there, I followed a very similar process, and the main thing to remember here is the length of the first strokes, the sharpness of the pencil, and also to make sure that the curve of your pencil follows the curvature of the back. I've seen many students in the past really struggle with this because they're not curving their pencil enough, and also making sure to keep those individual strokes close together as well, because that is going to help to build up the fineness of those feathers. The feathers here appear fairly straight on top and then they curve around, especially around where they overlap the wing. It does sound like a minor detail, but it really does make all the difference in making that realistic appearance. So now onto the wings, and this part of the bird almost has like a jigsaw puzzle or stained glass window type of thing going off here, so it can feel a little bit overwhelming at first, but by breaking it down into smaller sections, it really does make it easier to manage. I started with the most prominent and darkest shapes first, and let me just say this: if you stop thinking about it as drawing a bird and instead look at it like a collection of random geometric shapes, it really completely changes your approach, and suddenly you're starting to work in a more controlled and logical way. Trust me, it really does help. So with that in mind, I began by blocking in the bright yellows and the deep blacks, and at this stage I didn't worry about the shadows, I just focused on filling in those bold shapes. Once the base colours went down, I went back and layered details and shadows on top of the yellow to add some more depth, and of course my trusty olive green yellowish came to the rescue again. So for the wing on the front, I wanted to capture those beautiful bright white tips at the edges of each feather layer, and to keep them crisp and controlled, I use a sharp black pencil to carefully outline around the white areas. Okay, I could have coloured everything black and scraped away the white edges with my knife, but this way it just gave me more precision and more control over the actual shape of them. But after that, I did use the knife tool just for a little bit of tidying up, and it just basically sharpened everything and cleaned up the edges. Next, I moved on to the pine branches. These felt a little intimidating at first, and I did think, how on earth am I going to tackle this? But once I did get started, I worked out a method that turned out to be really simple and effective. So the main colour I used for these branches was the Polychromos Permanent Green Olive. I began by blocking in the basic structure of all the pine needles with this colour. And at first I had to make a few adjustments, like thickening up the individual spines. I wanted them to look like pine needles, not feathers, so I made sure that they were thick enough. But once that was all sorted, I added a touch of brown for those central branches. From there, I layered in some darker greens to bring out the shadows that sit along the inside edges of the needles, and I applied a little bit of a firmer pressure here to really lay down that darker colour. The craft knife came in really handy here as well. It was perfect for gently scraping away those really tiny highlight reflections on the top of the pine needles, and also the central branch as well. It kind of gave it a little bit of a 3D appearance. And I used the sharp edge to make those lines really clean and crisp, which then led me on to the highlights. I added some May green, which I think is a really happy green, and it also contrasts really nicely against those darker forest type greens. I added this colour into the areas I'd just scraped away, and it really brought those lighter green highlights to life. So after that, I spent some time tidying up things and applying some warmer yellows and browns just to show where the sunlight was catching those brown branches. So within each branch, I paid close attention to where the light was hitting and where the deepest shadows were. So this really helped to really bring out the depth by pulling those shadows forward with the darker greens, and even adding a little touch of black just to pinpoint the absolute deepest of shadows. Next, I moved on to the berries, and I will admit I really look forward to working on these. I began by marking out all of the tiny little stalks using a black Polychromos pencil, and this acted as kind of a guide to help me keep track of the placement of each berry, basically to avoid getting lost because there are so many of them. So once the stalks were in place, I went straight in with a layer of red to block in each and every berry and basically to cover the white of the surface. I believed I used pale geranium lake for the initial layer. I found this red to be quite a neutral red. It wasn't too dark, not too bright, not too pinky red and not too orangey red. It was kind of in the middle. So my goal here was to build up saturation gradually and let that colour intensify with each layer. With that base layer in place, I shifted my focus to shading in the shadows on each berry. At this stage, I wasn't really too concerned about it looking neat. I just wanted to block in the shadows with a darker reddish violet tone, and that really helped define the placement of the light and the dark areas. So as I worked, I gradually increased the pressure of my pencil, just building up a smooth, even surface. So one of my key goals for the berries was to eliminate any visible paper grain or pencil texture in this case. I wanted to capture that smooth, glossy look of real berries. So to enhance that shiny appearance, I used my electric eraser with a slightly blunt tip just to pull out some soft, subtle highlights, and making sure that the tip was blunt, it avoided any harsh, crisp edges because I really wanted that shine to look quite smooth and soft. So next I added my main red tone, which was the middle cadmium red, and I used this colour to really saturate the berries fully. So by increasing the pressure, this enabled me to bring out a smooth, even layer of colour, and that really emphasised that shiny, plump type of appearance. So although the berries look quite close to being finished at this stage, I did then add a final layer of pale geranium lake, which is the same colour I used as the base layer. And this acted as a polishing layer, or sometimes called burnishing, which is basically using a firm pressure to eliminate the pencil texture, and this just subtly tones the overall berries to give them a slight, smooth, glossy type of appearance. So with that being said, guys, we're drawing towards the end of the piece now. I've finished with the bird feet, the branch and all those nitty gritty details to pull it all together. I just want to give a big shout out and thank you to Jill Merritt for allowing me to use your beautiful photo as reference for myself and my students. Hugely appreciated. And thank you so much for you guys too for watching this video. And with that being said, I'll see you on the next one. Take care and farewell.